I stumbled across neuroscience by complete accident. I was doing executive coaching, leadership development, organisational change, and I was searching for some sort of evidence that proved some of the things that I knew worked in terms of, good leadership and approaching change in a way that didn't freak people out. And when I discovered this, I thought, wow, I've been carrying my brain around in my head for 40 years and I haven't paid it any attention. And there was so much evidence that and backed by science. And so I just dove into it as fast as I could. I read everything I could get my hands on and started to weave it into some of the work that I was doing, and people were as excited by it as I was.
Hello and welcome. Welcome to another episode of the Finding Equilibrium Show. I'm delighted to be here, delighted you're here, and delighted that my guest today is the wonderful Linda Ray. And Linda is the CEO of Neurocapability and the co-founder of the Institute of Organisational Neuroscience. So you sound like the absolute perfect person to speak to at this point in time where it feels like we're in so much chaos. But welcome, Linda. How are you? And where are you speaking to us from today?
Thank you, Lawrence. It's lovely to have this opportunity to have a chat with you. And I'm dialing in from beautiful Brisbane. It's a lovely sunny day here today.
Amazing. So maybe for those people who aren't familiar with your work, I'd love you to take a few moments just to tell us a little bit of your backstory. How did you become the CEO of Neurocapability? I'd love to hear a little bit of your story.
Sure. In 2006, I stumbled across neuroscience by complete accident. I was doing executive coaching, leadership development, organisational change, and I was searching for some sort of evidence that proved some of the things that I knew worked in terms of, good leadership and approaching change in a way that didn't freak people out. And when I discovered this, I thought, wow, I've been carrying my brain around in my head for 40 years and I haven't paid it any attention. And there was so much evidence that and backed by science. And so I just dove into it as fast as I could. I read everything I could get my hands on and started to weave it into some of the work that I was doing, and people were as excited by it as I was. And so I decided, wow, I need to share this with the world. And so I set up Neurocapability, and we've been offering an advanced diploma of neuroscience and leadership to students around the globe. But I guess I was really thinking about how can we amplify impact, because really I'm on a mission to change the world one brain at a time, and we want to rewire the brains of 100 million leaders to lead with the brain in mind, because that's where we know when we do that, we create psychologically safe workplaces, we support well-being at work. And so I'm on this mission, and it's been a wonderful journey, and we have a whole community now that are supporting us in that journey. Our alumni are taking these ideas into their workspaces, and that we know as we amplify that impact, then hopefully we'll see change, because I think the ways that we've led have been so prehistoric, and we really need to be thinking about how do we bring a human-centric approach to what we're doing. And I think the pandemic has escalated this kind of shake up of how we do things. So, I love my work. I love my team. I love doing what I do. I get out of bed and, find joy, and I feel very blessed for that.
Wonderful. So maybe to pick up on one of those terms that you said, human-centric workplace. What does that look like? Like, if we really get it right, and we are leading with a human-centric focus, how do we know when we've got there? What are the signs that an organization is human-centric?
I might start by saying the signs that aren't, if I could, Lawrence, because I think that's a really good place to start. One of the things I think that we've seen for so many years is a profit-centric approach, or a outcome approach. And so this is putting profits above people. And so we've seen people, even in the pandemic, asked to do more with less, and not seeing that people are your most valuable resource. Without people, you're never going to get results. And we saw the Newcrest CEO recently come out and say, hey, I've been using a command and control approach and bullying, and I've now realized this is the wrong approach. When we're human-centric, we value people, we support people, we look at well-being, we look at psychological safety. And I think that that's come a little bit more into focus now with the pandemic. And if you look at what happened when, with Omicron, and, we saw supermarkets again with no baby shelves, and the staffing shortages in the aged care and the health sector. People are the most important resource, and yet we treat them as commodities with endless amounts of energy, which is not the case. So when we think about people are our core resource. So how do we see them as the most important resource, and how do we support them to perform at their best so that we do get the outcomes that we're looking for in organisations? But I've worked with organisations that they just look at the profit, they just look at revenue, and it's push. We've got to get these results, and that doesn't work. People don't respond to that. That doesn't motivate people.
I completely agree. From a metrics point of view, because often it's all about balance. I mean, this is a Finding Equilibrium show, and what you're describing is a company very focused on profits, but not necessarily looking at the wider picture. What are the metrics that an organization should look at to know if they are human-centric, if they do have a psychologically safe environment? I'd love your thoughts on that.
I think there's some really interesting metrics, and my dad is presently in aged care and he's very unwell, which I've firsthand experienced 2 facilities that he's been in, one with very low psychological safety and one with, I can feel it as I walk in the door. Where he is right now, there is very high psychological safety. Now, the metrics, a lot of people would go into an aged care facility and they'd say, what's your staff to resident ratio? That's not the question to ask. The question to ask is, how many agency staff are you having to use? So the first facility my dad was in, there was a new person every day. They didn't have the opportunity to get to know Dad. And, people would say to us, no, I'm leaving because it's just so toxic, the environment here. So I think that's, when we look at metrics, we're often looking at the wrong metrics. Even if you think about from a revenue perspective, we look at revenue as opposed to, in retail, it might be sales conversion rates. But the interesting thing is, in the research that we've done in looking at the link between psychological safety and metrics, is there are relationships. So we know when there's higher levels of psychological safety, we see improvements in performance. But even in metrics, I think the other interesting metric right now is around unplanned absences. So, how many people are taking that sickie? As soon as you get your sickie, you're having a day off. To me, that kind of describes a workforce that is not as engaged as you would like them to be. I think the other interesting thing is, one of my close girlfriends, she's a midwife, and she's 50s, so she describes herself as being in the oldies group. And she is contracted, like many of the staff her age, for 2 shifts a week, maybe 4 shifts a week. And so what she has started to do is to say, you know what, I'm only going to do my 2 shifts. And she was picking up 4 shifts, and as were her colleagues. So the other interesting thing is, there's a whole bunch of metrics that we're not looking at. So this was this pool of resources for this hospital that now has shrunk down. So they haven't lost staff, but they've lost the additional shifts that those staff are picking up. So you have to be very clever when you look at the different metrics that tell you, because the typical metrics we look at, they tell you a story, but what are the metrics we're not looking at that tell you another story? I think even we've seen really a massive escalation in psychological distress claims, which then impacts workers' compensation premiums. So there's lots of things that we could be looking at that are almost warning signs that you're not doing so well in that human-centric area.
It's so interesting hearing you speak, because the example you described in terms of your father's home, you described you feel it. It's interesting because I think we all know when we are in a psychologically safe environment because we feel it, we feel relaxed. Engagement is quite a popular metric, but one question I have with a lot of the engagement surveys that I know companies do, often I feel that, and you may have a completely different view, but often some of the surveys are geared towards getting results to impress shareholders, which may not necessarily provide the actual truth. And we were talking just before about total impact, and what you're saying is there's lots of different metrics, and even the command and control approach that we spoke about before was, I guess the belief is that he got the results. The question I would always have is at what cost? You know, what was the cost? What were the consequences on the people?
Yeah, if I can kind of
please
comment on engagement. So if you think about what is the key metric every organisation should be measuring, I believe it's psychological safety at the team level. But and that's a lead indicator. So we know that engagement is a result of how psychologically safe people feel. Well-being is a result of how psychologically safe people feel. Culture is impacted by how psychologically safe people feel. And yet, what do? We do cultural surveys, we do engagement surveys, and they tend to be very long and they give, a huge amount of data. And then what do people do with it? And that's the interesting part, then people are tasked with coming up with an engagement action plan or a cultural action plan. And I was talking actually with two people that are, like chief people officers, and they said, you know what, I find my engagement plummets when I think about doing an engagement survey. And so I kind of go, why do we have this obsession with measuring engagement when it's a lag indicator? When there are other ways of actually finding out what's the psychological safety of each team, and how do we then go in and support those leaders to develop the skills to positively influence the psychological safety of the people that they're leading. Because typically we put people in a leadership position because they're good at their job, they're technically competent, but then we don't give them the manual for leading people. So we set them up to fail. And I think 75% of employees say the most stressful aspect of their job is their boss. And I don't think we can blame it on them. They haven't been given those, and I hate the term soft skills because I actually think they're the hard skills, but they haven't been given those skills that mean they can get the best out of their people, or that they can self-regulate and self-manage so that they come to work, as their best and show up as the best leader they can be.
Just on picking up on that point around skills. So do you believe it's possible to train any leader to develop and improve their, let's call them soft skills, so that they can be a more engaging, more impactful leader? Or do you feel that some of these behaviors are hardwired into who we are, and sometimes we have to play to our strengths? I'd love your view in terms of how you would go about with an organization that had challenges with managers and leaders in the way we've been describing, like how you would go about providing solutions to actually help enhance those people. Would it be this person is in the wrong job, or yes, we can work with this person and we can help them develop empathy, develop better communication? I'd love your perspective on that.
Yeah, look, I have worked with literally hundreds of leaders, and it's very rare that I find a leader that can't learn those things. And I think that there's an interesting, Simon Baron-Cohen talks about 0 degrees of empathy. So he talks about empathy being on like a bell curve. And, on the left, we have people that would be described as having psychopaths and narcissists, through to people that have too much empathy, empaths. So I think that with leaders, when we are working with leaders that have more narcissistic tendencies, I believe they're hard to shift, because it's very difficult to they often have poor insight into, because they're very much geared about self, and obviously people with psychopathic tendencies, that's very difficult. But I think anyone else on that bell curve, I think you can do some work with them, and I've seen it. And I think the beauty about bringing science is it's substantial. It's not something that's airy fairy for people. Like, I think in my early days, I was doing a lot of, values-based work, and, that didn't always resonate with people. But once you start talking about threat in the brain and reward, and how you as a person can generate that just by conversation, you see that kind of makes sense. And I've worked with people that typically would be not necessarily on the right-hand side of the bell curve, and I've seen massive shifts. And I remember I was working in the resource sector, and a superintendent chased me across the yard, and he said, "What have you done to my people?" I said, "Oh my gosh, what do you mean?" He said, they're talking to each other, and they're being nice, and they're doing what they're supposed to do." And it's really interesting. Like, he was really shocked, because he'd seen his people go to so many different leadership programs, and there'd been no shift or no change. So yeah, wow. I do. I mean, I think everyone can learn this stuff. I think we can improve our emotional intelligence, and and we know when you have greater levels of emotional intelligence, you have greater self-awareness, greater emotion regulation, and so yeah, definitely think it can be learned.
That's super encouraging. I mean, I agree, and that's I love that story that you just shared, because that kind of highlights, the fact is that we can learn these skills. We just haven't had the opportunity, and if you're given the opportunity, it's a process. Let's move on now and talk a little bit about, given where we are, and no one knows, but it feels like hopefully we're in the final act of the pandemic, which let's keep our fingers crossed and everything crossed. But of course, a lot of people have been really impacted, and I know we talk about post-traumatic stress, and you've got a great term called post-traumatic growth, which I love. It's so much better than post-traumatic stress. But I'd love you to to explain what that means, and how we deal with the level of overwhelm, how people are feeling. And many people are feeling very out of balance, exhausted, just had enough. And it's a very common story, not only in Australia, but around the world.
Yeah, when the pandemic sort of was in its early stages, I think 4 months in, I was doing some webinars on, why you might be feeling a little out of sorts. And I think it would be fair to say that people are now not just a little out of sorts, they're fed up. And there is huge emphasis, talking about people feeling burnt out, fatigued, overwhelmed, exhausted. And I guess there's also been quite a lot of emphasis on what is going to be the impact of this, in terms of post-traumatic stress. So you think about people in the health and aged care sector that have really been stretched to the limit. What are going to be the ongoing impacts of this? What's it going to be like when they relive holding someone's hand as they die without family members being present, working on a ward where there is inadequate staff to patient ratios, and mistakes are made and things get missed. And I think a lot of people are in the dip now. So if you think about, you've got to the point where it's, oh my gosh, I'm exhausted, and I didn't get to, I was looking forward to Christmas and hanging out with my family and those holidays, and then Omicron hit. And so I think that caused, even a greater level of impact on people, because there's one of the things that we know that keeps us going is anticipatory reward. And anticipatory reward helps to generate dopamine, and it helps to support us to feel motivated, because we're looking forward to something, and people haven't had something to look forward to. So that's been a massive impact, I think, on people. Now, post-traumatic growth is not a term that I coined. It's been around for a while, but it's this idea that if we there's two things that can happen. So the post-traumatic stress can then become to a point where it's a mental health condition. And I hate the term disorder, because it's actually not, there's not something wrong with this person. It's response to an acutely stressful event. And we know that the levels of stress have been, for so long. It's not just, been for 5 minutes or 5 months. It's been a very prolonged event. So when people stay in that kind of post-traumatic stress state, then that can lead to impairment and mental health challenges down the track. But what we're seeing is that I think a lot of people are kind of looking at this as an opportunity to take stock of their life right now. And we know that we can support what's called post-traumatic growth, which is kind of coming out the other end with a different view and a different perspective. And we know that there's several ways that people can do that. One is by education, actually understanding that what's happened to them and the impact is normal, but how do we support people to reflect on that? So we know when you move into post-traumatic growth, you talk about the impact of that event, and people need the opportunity. It's almost like to be able to debrief, if you like. And then we need an opportunity to kind of reflect on what were the strengths that I used to kind of manage through that, and what strengths am I going to tap into to move out the other side into a growth and resilience space. And we also know that people that move more into that post-traumatic growth can reflect on what's happened to them and kind of view it in a perspective of what did I learn and what will I take forward, having been through that acutely stressful event. And I think the other thing that we've noticed is that people are kind of going, what do I want to do with my life? Is this really what I want to do? And I think the example of my girlfriend, who has said, no, I'm just going to do my 2 shifts, and I'm going to spend time at my beach shack, and I'm going to spend more time with my elderly mother, looking after her and spending time with her. So people are recalibrating and saying what's important. That's, I think, behind a lot of the great resignation right now. And the other area is around service. So we know that post-traumatic growth is supported by people giving to others. And we know when we give to others that generates oxytocin, which is really good for social well-being. And one of the things that I've been really curious about recently is, how do we support people who are in that more dip space, but we might be more in this post-traumatic growth space? And I think there's service that we can offer when we're in this space to people that are in this space. And so it all started with a bit of an idea of from a show called New Amsterdam, which I love, and it's a public hospital in New York, and this new medical director, Max Goodman, comes on board, and he has a very different approach, and much to the horror of the board in this show. And so he simply asks, how can I help? And I think that people are very surprised, by that. But I think that's something that we can do right now to support other people. And it's not just asking a person, how can I help? Because I think we can say, are you okay? And a lot of people are saying, no, I'm not okay. And so I think we can say, well, how can I help? And they may say, I don't know. And that's okay. But it may be that you say, well, how can I, maybe I could do some meals for you, or maybe I could pick up your kids from school. So it's how can we help? But I think there's another aspect to it, and it's actually asking it internally, how can I help? So if I go back to my dad and the aged care facility, it was in lockdown just before Christmas. We had this beautiful anticipatory reward of spending Christmas with my dad, which didn't happen. And yeah. And anyway, I kind of thought, well, how can I help the people here that I interact with? So from the moment I step in the door of that facility, I greet the person at the desk and I say, how are you? How's your day been? And wow, it must be tough, because we all have to do a RAT prior to getting into the home. So on top of this person's normal job, they've got then to administer these tests to everyone that comes in. So it's just saying, yeah, that must be tough, just acknowledging it. Going up into the staff that are looking after my dad and thanking them. Say, thank you so much for looking after my dad. I really appreciate what you're doing. The person emptying the bin the other day, I said, thank you so much for looking after my dad. how's your day been? And she looked at me like, oh my God. You know, so it's what can I do that shows appreciation to these people. And, you know, so it's this service I think is really key. And so I want to start a how can I help movement.
I love that. I would join. I really love that. It's so true, isn't it? It's interesting what you describe as the kind of dip and you're in the growth kind of phase. Because I had a similar situation. I had a blood test the other day, and clearly the person who was doing the blood test was not happy to, you know, you could tell very, very stressed. So I just said, how were you? And she ignored me completely initially. And then she responded. It was an interesting, because it made me realize that, you know, ultimately, we're connecting with humans, and we can treat them with kindness and compassion, and we always have that choice, no matter what we're actually feeling. So, but I love this how can I help movement. I think this is wonderful, because collectively there's so many skills, and I think we definitely saw a lot of that. I mean, you know, through the pandemic, like always, it brings out that kind of traumatic experience, brings out the best and the worst in people. You know, we saw a lot of people helping communities, you know, trying to do. And I think as it went into different phases, then, you know, perhaps the behavior changed. But I love that. So I can see that movement really taking off. All right, so let me ask you the one last question, which I ask everybody. And you know, given this is the Finding Equilibrium show, it's all about balance. I'd love your perspective on what finding equilibrium means to you, and also how personally what you do on a daily basis to find your own equilibrium. You know, you're running a business. You're really driving a lot of change, a lot of progress, but obviously you can only do that if you're in balance yourself. And I'd love to know how you maintain, you know, your own equilibrium, and what finding equilibrium means to you.
Look, I think that's a great question, because I hate the idea of work-life balance, because I think that doesn't make sense to me. But yeah, how do you find equilibrium at work in a way that works for you? And I think it's a very individual story. For me, I feel blessed because I've learned so many tools and strategies, and I've completely rewired my brain so that I'm very good at self-regulating. The past 2 years have been the toughest years of my life, from a personal perspective, you know, with a very ill dad and a bunch of other stuff going on. What I've really been focusing on in terms of equilibrium is to think about, how do I make sure that I build anticipatory reward into my everyday life? And this actually came from my daughter. So my daughter's a social worker, and she works in the front line. She does very tough work, outreach work with very, very challenging people. And she said to me, I've been told to come up with a self-care plan. And she said, and you know, to guard against burnout. And I said, and she said, I hate that. It makes me feel broken. And I said, so have you got another idea? And she said, yeah, I'm going to romanticize life. And I said, what does that mean? And she said, well, every day I'm going to wake up and I'm going to think of one thing that I can do when I get home from work that will give me joy. And I thought, wow. And when I thought about it, what she's done, when you focus on, I'm broken, I'm burnt out, you actually generate more cortisol, and you actually increase the levels of stress. So what she was doing is actually this anticipatory reward of something that she was going to look forward to. So I think finding equilibrium is making sure you're looking after yourself, that you have an anticipatory reward plan. So I think about every day, what is something that I'm going to look forward to doing at the end of my day, no matter how tough it is. And so that's how I find equilibrium, and also staying connected with other people. We're very social humans, and you know, social needs are a primary driver of every person on the planet. And I really did find it challenging, because I was isolating so that I didn't take COVID into the home when I was seeing my dad. And I really missed that social connection. So making sure that you stay connected, I think, helps build equilibrium. And I think also finding how you can help. You know, that just
that,
you know,
that
being
result.
in service of other people as well.
I love that. Yeah, find a joy list, connect with other people, and help others. I really love that. So let's talk a little bit about the work that you do, because we've talked a lot about the benefits of a psychologically safe environment, the benefits of self-regulation, if you like, the challenges of overwhelm and some of those things. And you've mentioned about rewiring your brain. I'd love to, which is wonderful, and we've talked about the fact that we can rewire our brain. The program that you do, because I know you do a lot of trainings and leadership training to really help people rewire their brain. So I'd love to learn more about the programs that you run and how people can find out more about the work that you do.
Yeah, look, I think probably our flagship program is our Advanced Diploma of Neuroscience Leadership, and that's an 18-month online program. And that equips people with the skills to learn to self-regulate and, you know, cope with stress. It supports people to make better decisions and problem solve. And all of this is with the brain in mind. It supports people to build psychological safety in their teams and positively influence it so that you can collaborate and work better together. And also a focus on how do we facilitate building new habits, pursuing goals and doing change in a way that works. So that's it. I think it's firstly we need to educate people so that they can then change in the ways in which they lead and engage with others in the workplace. The second thing I think that's really important in the work that we do is we measure psychological safety, and we support organisations to build a psychological safety strategy that is data driven. And I think one of the things I'm seeing right now that really concerns me is there's a very reactive response to what's going on right now. Oh, we need to do something about well-being. Let's give people free coffees and let's give them lunch and bean bags. Oh, we need to give everyone mental health first aid training, without actually going, well, what is the current state of play and how do we develop a very strategic approach to improving well-being, engagement, mental health, because they're all linked. And even, you know, I think about people that are doing safety leadership. Well, leadership is leadership. So really we need to be bringing the safety people together with the well-being. So we've siloed this in organisations. There's a well-being lead, there's a people lead, there's a safety lead. Actually, we need to be bringing all of that together and building a coherent strategy. And so that's the kind of thing that I love doing, because it's data, it's research-based, and it actually supports people to really get a picture of what's going on in their organisation. We go right down to very small brain bites that, you know, anyone can access, but we're also, we'll be launching soon a psychological safety program that is aimed at leaders. And I think that that's a really key area that we need to be focusing a lot of attention on, is how do we equip those leaders who have been, you know, promoted because of their technical expertise, but don't have the handbook. So I guess we kind of work in a way of giving people that handbook, the kind of the driver's manual to their brain, so that they can lead with the brain in mind.
Wonderful work. And where can people find you? So clearly on LinkedIn, but your website?
On LinkedIn, and also neurocapability.com.au.
Well, Linda, let me acknowledge you for the amazing work that you're doing. Amazing. I love your mission. You know, I know you've been on the mission for a long time, but it really feels that the pandemic, ironically, has really highlighted and made a lot more people aware of the critical importance of people. A lot of times people maybe think it's profits or people, but of course the people lead to the profits, and the more we see that,
you get that piece right and the success will come.
Exactly. Well, wonderful to chat to you. Thank you so much for spending time with us. I know you're super busy, and we will see you again soon. And thank you everyone for listening, and we will see you next time. Take care now.